on the River Nile, which is a very important part of the Egyptian culture. They actually call it the River of Life, and by the end of this presentation, I hope that you would agree that it is actually the River of Life. We'll wait and see how you feel by the end of the presentation. So the first one is just about getting a bit of a sense of where Egypt is. So you can see Australia down here where we are. Okay, so we sort of understand Australia, and we live here in Sydney, Camps Creek, just there. And then if we move all the way over to this part of the world, we see Africa as the continent, and we see that Egypt is in the top sort of corner of Africa, and it's actually sort of quite close to the Middle East as well. So it's in that particular region. So let's have a little bit of a closer look at that. So this is Africa itself, and as you can see, Egypt's just at the top, okay, sort of right-hand corner of Africa. So let's have a look at what it looks like on a map and where this River Nile is. So you can see Egypt, okay, really close up in different parts of Egypt. And you can see the River Nile itself, as I'm sort of running along with the cursor, runs all the way along this country. So you can see how significant it is, sort of splits Egypt, not quite in the middle, but to the right-hand side of the middle. When we have a look at the Google images, you can see here that the section that I just sort of showed you on that sort of drawn map is very green in the middle. And when I go to the next slide, you'll see that that green is not just the River Nile, but to the left and right of it, you can see how brown it is. And the brownness is just a suggestion of how much of a sort of hot and arid country Egypt is, and it's pretty inhospitable. So there's not a lot of places where you can actually live. When you see closer, and you can see the Nile itself, which is the darker little line here, which is the water, you can see on either side there's some green, but then just beyond that green, there is really just pockets of green and mainly brown. Okay, and that brown again suggests that it's really hot and very arid there, almost desert-like. And obviously, people can live in here where there's water and a little bit of hydration and some green, but people find it very difficult to live out here in the brown parts. And we'll sort of look at that a little bit more as we go. This is an actual picture of the Nile, probably a little bit more recent, obviously, with the satellites. It's not from ancient Egypt, but it does give you the idea of how important the Nile is and where they actually sort of build their buildings. So you can see they build right on top of the water because this is the place where they can get the most out of this, out of the source of the Nile. So it's pretty important that they set themselves up really close to it. And you can see even just beyond the water, it's very dry. Okay, even on the edges of the water, it's not necessarily very green. Straight there. So it's pretty dry country. So the Nile, that sort of waterway gives them a great deal, and we'll look at how much it gives them in the next few slides. So why is it so important? Obviously, number one, it's a source of food. Okay, so that's essential to any civilization. And when you think about it as a source of water as well, you think about what we studied in Lake Mungo and Cow Swamp with our own Aboriginal Indigenous people, that they set up their communities near food and water because they knew that that was essential to survival. So obviously the ancient Egyptians knew the same thing, that waterway was a really, really important part of setting up a civilization that could actually last and survive. The other big thing, as we saw in the image, that the waterway goes all the way up Egypt. So it's a great source of transport. You can move things from one part of Egypt to the other. So that's a really fantastic sort of point for us to understand that the transport was really, not necessarily easy, but it was definitely achievable. And the other one is because of its importance and how essential it is to the people, it became really significant in terms of their religious beliefs. Okay, so we'll have a little bit more of a look at that as well. So if we go to the first one, the big thing about the River Nile and why it was such an important waterway and why it was such a consistent source of food for the Egyptian people was that it had this regular cycle. It had these three seasons. The first one, the time of inundation, which is like a flood. So this was caused by the snow melting up on the mountains and some heavy rain periods. And then when that happened, obviously the water helped the community to be able to plant crops. And then after the sun came out and they'd sprout, they'd like grow, then they were able to sort of harvest them, and then they had a bona fide food source that they could use again and again. And if it happened every year, this cycle, then obviously their food source would be outstanding. So the big other thing about the flood and the inundation is that it brought down this dark mountain silt. So when the snow melted, it actually brought some of the mountain with it, and this silt was the reason why the soil was so rich. It had so many nutrients in it, and that made it far easier for them to be able to farm. So obviously, then the floods would, the water would rise with the floods, and then the flood would go back down, and the water would sort of drop down in terms of its level, and the farmers would be able to plant the crops in this really, rich soil, this really fertile soil where things would grow really, really easily and grow quickly because the soil was so good. And they planted lots of different things. So you can see there they've got wheat and barley and lentils, things like grains. But then they also had beans and onions and cucumbers, so vegetables, and then grapes and figs and dates. They had fruit as well. So the Nile gave them a variety of food sources, not just one type. Obviously, this fertile land was essential to them, and they called it the Black Land because of the color of the black silt. And this is where the population was at its highest, okay? Because obviously, anywhere around that fertile land meant that people had resources and they had access to food. Beyond that, where we showed you, some images where it was quite brown and maybe even I guess in different points when it's really hot red, they called it the Red Land, the desert. And obviously, very few people lived there because there was not, it was not as easy to live there, not as hospitable, and there weren't as many food sources. The waterways also had fish, okay, which they could fish for and eat the fish. Also, the water attracted ducks and geese, who obviously had their food sources in the water as well, and that allowed them to kill those animals as well and eat them. The nature of that really fertile land meant that they could keep cattle and sheep and pigs and goats and feed them and make sure that they were healthy, and then obviously too that they could use them as a food source when they saw fit. The only other thing, even though it's not a source of food, was the papyrus, which was a reed that grew alongside the Nile. And the Egyptian people used this to create lots of things. So paper, number one, baskets to be able to carry and collect their crops and their fruit and vegetables. Furniture, okay, which then became like a fairly important thing to be able to make sure that they could live in comfort, and then boats, which when we get to transport will make sense because they obviously needed a vessel to be able to move things from one point of the Nile to the next. So here are a few images about food. So you can see in the top right hand corner, okay, if I just put my cursor around it so you can see it, you see the ducks and the fish and some grains. So you can see there that they had a variety of food sources. If you come over here and look at this image on the left hand side, okay, you can sort of see the process of how they made grain, and this is obviously the wheat itself when they're pulling it out. So you can see like a little bit of it gives you a little bit of an understanding of how they sort of worked hard with limited sort of tools, to be able to make the wheat into grain. Then obviously number two, in terms of the importance of the Nile, is about the water. Okay, and obviously it's a pretty simple thing that you need water to be hydrated. And the River Nile was a fresh waterway, so that meant that it's drinkable water. So obviously salt water would do the opposite. It would actually dehydrate you. So fresh waterways are really important, okay, because that you can drink straight from that source. So not only did they drink, but they made beer by combining it with barley and wheat. And I didn't write it there, but they probably also combined it with grapes to make wine. So it was an important source of their, recreation and enjoyment as well, in having beer and wine. Also, instead of just like sort of waiting for the water to flood, what they did is they created some irrigation, a little bit probably similar to some of the work we did around Mesopotamia, and they were then allowed to plant crops further from the river so they could get the water, channel it, okay, and make sure that it could get to other places because obviously, like we said, it's really dry. So the further they could make the water move, the more likely it was that more people could live in those areas. And the other main, sort of use they had for water was to wash their clothes, obviously, and they would bring it in like pottery tubs, collect the water, bring it back, wash the clothes, and they would also bathe themselves. And sometimes the Egyptian bathhouses were quite large and lavish, so they obviously need quite a lot of water. And the slaves probably would have brought that water in those pottery jugs, to make sure that it was full and ready for the pharaohs and for the rich. So you can see on the right-hand side what I'm talking about with that big pool of water, and it's very elaborate. And obviously that's just an animated image of it, but that is consistent with what archaeologists have said it would have looked like. And then on the left-hand side, you see that the lady there is either pouring water or wine for her sort of master. The third most important thing about the River Nile was its ability to create transport systems. So obviously, the ability to be able to move goods from one community to another means that you can trade. And that allows you, if you've got resources, to share with another community and obviously hopefully get something that they've got too much of, so that you can both have better things. We see this in most of the civilizations we've studied, including Mesopotamia and our own indigenous culture. So we see that this is quite a common part of a civilization that is forward thinking and is able to survive. The big thing too that they did with the waterways is they used those vessels, those boats that we talked about before, and they transported stone blocks. Now this was really important in the building of the pyramids. When you sort of focus on the pyramids, you'll notice that they're so important to the pharaohs and to the people, and to pay homage to the gods. So getting the best resources was essential, and obviously, no pun intended, but there was no stone unturned to get those best resources, and they bring them down the Nile to make sure that they could use them. The river was also part of their rituals and their, the symbolism around, their transport of the bodies of the pharaohs, and they would take them on the River Nile. And obviously, when we get to religion, you'll see with Isis it has some significance that they bring it along that waterway to regenerate the pharaoh before they get placed in the tomb into their afterlife. So you can see here some images. The top left is one where we see this sort of symbolic, sort of riding with the gods. But then down below, it's actually probably a more recent photo, and you can start to see how they're still using the Nile as a waterway to transport what looks like sugarcane in that particular image. And here too, this image is really good because it shows you a lot of different aspects. It's got the bird life. It's obviously got blokes out there fishing and moving things from one place to another. And you can see how populated it is around the areas, because that's where the most the ability to survive is easiest. So the last really important part about why it's so important to the Egyptian people, to the ancient Egyptians, is their religious beliefs. So they really believed in this idea of Ma'at, which meant they thought that Ma'at was really important, and that it confirmed that there was an order to the world. So the idea of this cosmic order, that everything had a flow and a rhythm, when the Nile flooded every year, it just made the Egyptians believe in Ma'at more. And they said, yeah, see, it's a cycle, and it's going to happen. And that order gave them a lot of comfort. So that was really important. So the flooding and the Nile confirmed that Ma'at was a real thing. They also believed in the god Osiris, who was the god of the afterlife. Originally, the myth or the story goes that he was killed and thrown into the Nile, and that when the flooding actually happened, that it was from Osiris that the water came. So that it wasn't necessarily a geographical, natural thing like we know it might have been in science. They believed that it was the gods showing them good favor and saying, Osiris saying, yes, you can have your water again. In terms of that actual flooding, they had another god, and you'll see, like when you study that more closely, that they had lots of gods, and Hapi was the god of the flooding, and his image represents fertility, as that's essentially what the flooding was for Egypt, that fertile land that they could, sort of grow crops on. The big sort of advantage for the pharaohs was that they were considered to be gods on earth, and they had these divine powers. So the pharaoh was the one that would, make sure that Hapi and Osiris and everyone was in control to make sure that the flood occurred. So that's awesome for the pharaoh because it makes him seem really powerful, and it was a pretty reliable flood that happened every year. But I guess the real problem for the pharaoh was on that odd year where it didn't happen. It made the pharaoh look quite weak, and the flooding, sort of then suggested that there was a problem with that pharaoh, and it could have been a critical situation, in terms of the support and the power that they held within Egypt. So good and bad for the pharaoh in some ways. You can see here on the left-hand side Osiris, who's in green, and he's the god of the afterlife. But more than that, about regeneration and resurrection, because he actually got raised to life out of the Nile. And you can see that green is like, that idea of regeneration, okay, of regrowth, which would have happened to the waterways and to the land on the waterways. When the water came, it would have become green again, okay, because obviously the water would have made the grass and the crops grow. On the right hand side, we've got Hapi, and Hapi is the god of the Nile and the god of the inundation, of the flood itself. And again, you can see obviously Hapi is in blue, to really represent that water. So the final thing is then, well, what influence did the Nile have on the development of society? And I said at the start that they call it the river of life, and that we try and see if that was true by the end of the presentation. And the reality is, we can see from the Google images that Egypt's dry, really dry, a very dry climate. But the consistent flooding in the Nile meant that they could manage it and they could actually live and survive in that area. And obviously, the Egyptian civilization has lived and prospered for many, many years. Obviously, the reliance they had on the Nile meant that they needed to be really close to it. So that is why, in terms of the way that their society developed, it developed around the Nile, because the Nile was the source of life for them. So I think you can see that then that's how they set up their society. Everything sort of came in and around the flood and that sort of cycle, and obviously also around the Nile itself. So now I think you can better understand that it is essentially the river of life for them, because without it, they wouldn't have survived. Thanks, guys, for listening. I hope it has been somewhat helpful for you. And obviously, you can watch this as many times as you need to get the ideas that you need. All right, I'll just stop it there. Thanks, guys.